Chapter 1 Time to Dine. At the start of all things was not the word, but a manner of speaking, a form and flow of phonetic incursions wrought upon the universal canvas from some mind or mind of minds. This speaking was a set of thoughts and ideas in a rhythmic pattern indiscernible from the backdrop itself, save for a difference in what we would call coloration. Yet, as there may not have been any eyes to witness this occurrence, who is to say what colors there were, or if it happened at all? Yet, let us imagine that it did happen. Those words set in motion a long, tumultuous, and mostly unknown journey regarding all that was to become in the universe as we know it, and by proxy of our existence and the imagination therein, all that is in the universe, yet not completely part of it until it is brought into reality. Although it is never exactly as imagined, the fragments of that original manner of speaking somehow managed to cobble together a consciousness that could see the silly mistakes in being the figment of our own imagination. Perhaps that is the scope of all individuality, that what we think ourselves to be is lost in the transmission through us into the world, and what we see is a stark contrast in some cases, an outright fiction in many cases, when compared to how we want to see ourselves. If we quote the words that develop from the manner of speaking, those goofy little imagined words take on new dimensions regarding what and who is communicating. Truth be, communication is merely communication, and might have existed without folks to communicate. It just allows us to think we are necessary to its existence, because communication is a sweetheart like that. Sweethearted nature of communication aside, as though it has a heart and could ever truly be an aside, take that, Shakespeare! The questions of who communicates what, when, how they communicate it, and for what purpose, known or otherwise, are all concepts called into being once some of those tiny imagined words are put within the confines of tiny imagined quotes. As though any of this is real in any sense, and not a simple resonance of those sounds and rhythms that we have trained ourselves to translate into meaning of some kind or another, even without the air to transmit the sound, even if there was only paper that held these words, the words would still make to the mind of the one reading it sounds. Those sounds you hear and I make, regardless of the I who is speaking it, may have greater clarity when written, owing to the clarification regarding homonyms, but that is an unintentional digression from my point. These words might have meaning, and might have curious power in that their meaning is, at best, only truly clear to me and not really anything more than ambiguous sounds to anyone else unless they are being read. Don't giggle at me, I'm being serious. Even if the words weren't words, the sounds would be clear to a reader, while they are only accents of minor amusement to you. I illustrate. Bralg Marwana, harf drugugu. Mork arbiticu. Quilziab finzelglashoi. Buela, mangtrapu, fuana, to a duplip and to cornator you victorti, and I couldn't repeat that if I tried. Someone smacked Jason, Carl said. I think he broke his language center again. The four friends were doing their best to carry out a conversation in the restaurant in Austin. They were doing their best because they had made the agreement prior to arrival at the restaurant that they would not carry on a social interaction with friends who were not present by way of their highly functional devices of instantaneous communication. The mobile phones, with access to the wealth of human information available at the tips and swipes of their fingers across the glass screens, coated with a substance later in time discovered to be so nasty that the mere mention of it would send shivers down the spine of a staunch Luddite, were shut down and stowed in pockets and purses. Jason, Carl, Tabitha, and Danny began their dinner easy enough, discussing the possible selection from the menu of Indian cuisine. Soon, however, the lulls in the conversation became longer, and the decor could not be commented on any further in novel ways, and the mention of current entertainment spectacles that were local to the Austin scene had begun to meander to the realm of expressing how little they knew of their location's artistic soul. And then the pauses started to harbor looks of earnest longing toward the kitchen area in hopes of spotting the waitress to order a drink or discuss something that would make the decision to dine without cell phones a palatable one. And then it had picked up in a way most unusual. In her refusal to accept the mediocrity wrought upon her psyche by the constant connectivity to the sphere of friends and acquaintances, Danny started to speak about the idea of who she was, not being who she was portrayed as in the eyes of others. Ripples of tectonic activity screeched to a momentary halt to whisper sheer pangs of joy and glory at this reintroduction of organic philosophical discourse, and the moon barked like a hyena when the word of the event reached it. The conversation took a turn to what we could see as the real, with each noticing the nuances of language and less than languidly pursuing the perfection of their own communication so as to clearly state themselves in no uncertain terms, with the chief reason of being, in the eyes of their friends, the individuals they knew themselves to truly be. Carl was expressive with his facial expressions, smiling nearly constantly and trying to evoke the smiles of others. Jason was meticulous and verbose in his speaking, and would lose the visual connectivity with his friends as he spoke, as though reading the words in his mind from a script he wrote nanoseconds before speaking. Tabitha listened intently and made smooth gestures to express her understanding. When she spoke, it was with a tone of authority, yet she mostly asked questions. Danny, though, was content in having spurred this branch of the conversation and simply antagonized the others when she felt it necessary. The four friends had known each other for longer than they dared admit, in most cases, as the long-standing friendship denoted a personal investment in each other. Part of what allowed them to remain friends was their reluctance to delve too deep into the interests and developments of each other's lives, and consequently that left each with the embarrassing truth of having long-standing friendships with three other people of which they knew very little about. As they talked tonight, barely noticing the waitress when she interjected with the delicacies they had selected from the tandoori oven, they began to see a little further beyond the veil each wore with comfort around the others. The deeper the conversation went, the more the expressions came with ease, and Jason, with a professional life that left him with a need and time for a perpetual love of words and music, those two communicative attributes readily activating the temporal lobes of the brain, which are also responsible for feelings of religious and spiritual ecstatic fervor. He would say things like this last sentence as a means of apologizing for his rambling after Carl suggested the smack. "No harm, no foul, kiddo," Danny said. "No harm, but kind of foul to us shallow minds," added Carl. Tabitha looked across the table to her comedic friend, letting her eyes rest on Carl while giving a lopsided smile before speech redirected her attention to Jason. "I think that the essence of what you are saying is not lost in the mountains of, at times, too well-crafted strings of words." She placed her hand on the table in his direction and kept his eyes that usually darted with sporadic grace to various locations as he listened on her, as though he was following the trace elements in the air that were nudged by the breath of the speaker. He followed them back to her. "The idea that we speak words that muddle the communication of ourselves might be solved by the writing of those words." As Jason nodded towards Tabitha with a slight shrug and a playful frown to denote she was close enough, Danny chimed in with an equally playful yet far more sinister smile. "Sounds like you just want to be texting now." She leaned back and kept her eyes locked on Jason as he looked at her. Within a moment, he sensed his fear was evident and nervously began to chase the trace elements floating around due to the conversations at the other table. Carl diffused the situation from becoming more awkward by expanding on the premise Tabitha stated. "It doesn't need to be a text, but something greater, like if the singularity could reach back with microscopic recording devices and monitor all our conversations, transcribing all that we said. Why would an infinite intelligence of augmented human consciousness spend time hearing what we have to say?" Danny posed with mock solemnity. Carl was up to the challenge. "I don't know," he began while adjusting his buttocks in his chair while keeping his shoulders square to Tabitha across the way. "Maybe we're just that interesting. Or maybe you're that interesting," he turned his head to Danny on his right, "and I'm just good looking." Tabitha smiled as Jason snorted unintentionally. "Maybe it gets bored and records these things to transcribe it into books." "Why would it do that?" Danny asked with the same sardonic tone as her last question. Jason took the lead on this one, and Danny looked across the table to him. "Maybe the books it makes are shown to a higher state of reasoning within the singularity." "I think I speak for all us here," Carl said, suddenly jumping into Danny's camp and then looking emphatically at Jason. "What?" Danny giggled at that, and Jason shifted in his seat. "I'm talking about the workings of what we have discussed as the singularity, based on Kurzweil's notion of the blending of human and artificial intelligence, that the reasoning we experience is one of a corporeal and temporary self. But with the introduction of immortality, there would easily be states of reasoning that are higher than our own, which we cannot comprehend fully, but of which we can be aware." "Of which we can be aware," Tabitha echoed in admiration of the way Jason spoke. "You mean like angels," Danny said, less as a question than she had meant. Before she could chastise herself for her lacking control of her vocal tone in conversation, Carl added to her statement, "Or demons." Jason nodded toward Carl with his familiar shrug. "Or perhaps," Carl added to his composite statement with Danny, "even God," to be met with another shrugging nod from Jason. "It may not be as dramatic as that." Tabitha bounded into the conversation after quickly clearing her throat, causing the attention of each to turn directly to her. "It could be any reader. Sure, we could say a goddess, Both Carl and Jason gave Jason's usual nodding shrug, causing Carl to smile for his perfectly timed mimicry. Or a god, but how about we just say reader? Tabitha looked at Danny to make clear her tone that warped the Inquisition right out of her statement was not accidental. I see. Okay, Danny replied in a near trance towards Tabitha. So this reader has access to our conversations to gain clear understanding of what we are meaning to say, and can also garner tidbits of kinesthetic direction or personal intention from little add-ons between moments of dialogue. Like whatever is outside of the quotes, Carl said, making the hand gestures for quotes. And it would see the hand gesture you made to accent that, Jason added. If we're going to be this redundant, it's no wonder why it would rather read about us than hang out with us, said Danny. Maybe reading about us is how it hangs out with us, Jason pondered. How well could the reader really get to know us just by reading our words, Danny retorted. Well enough, I hope, to care for us, Jason responded. Tabitha cleared her throat again, and the other three looked at her, suddenly made aware by her sheepish expression that they had interrupted her. The notion of a reader, divine or otherwise, being able to know what we are by virtue of what we say, is to limit the reader's scope of possibly knowing us to what we choose to express. Only if you choose every word you say, Danny willfully interrupted. Yeah, sunshine, you should try that sometime, Carl rebuked Danny. But how much of our own selves can be expressed in words, and how much in other actions? Tabitha asked the table, overlooking Carl and Danny, who peered at each other for an extra moment following their interaction. And wouldn't intention of thought and the realm of the mind also be an expression, although not outward? Jason added with a sincere hopefulness that a reader would plumb the depths of his psychic experiences as he went about his part of the way through the world. I think there would be cause for the reader to know us on that level as well, Tabitha reassured Jason. If we have that level, Carl jibed. Tiring of her role as instigator, Danny felt the need to speak. Everyone has that level. Each of us can reach realities within ourselves that can overpower how we see the world as it is. That is the point to this talk. That each of us has the ability to have our view of reality run askew from perfect accuracy, and in doing such, we see others only so much as we like to see them, only to the extent that we want to see them. She leaned forward and lightly braced herself on the table, her long, thin arms creating an elegant frame in that moment of anticipation. Her plump lips tightened into a mischievous smile that parted with her next words. If I were the reader, I might not even grasp much of what I'm glimpsing because of how I want to see my reality outside of the book we are. She leaned back, cocking her head slightly to her left to expose the right side of her slender neck slightly. A man across the room paid less attention to his floral dessert than he did to her milky skin. Honestly, she continued, if we are so wrapped up in our lives that we don't even connect up with others to see them as they truly are, what chance would the reader have to understand us for our total selves? A pause occurred as Jason nervously glanced around the room, Tabitha sipped some water from the glass in her right hand, and Carl puffed his cheeks out with a mouth full of air as he contemplated. I would hope that whatever would be reading would have insight enough into our thoughts and being that who we are would be evident, Jason said, not looking at anyone around the table. Hope is nice, and that would be great, but without my saying it, would the reader know I have dyed my hair red? Danny asked. Is that what is different about you? Carl gestured with a circular wave of his hand, denoting that his attention to the detail of Danny's person was lacking until that point. See what I mean? Danny gestured back at Carl. If holy Nimrod the Terrible over here didn't even notice that I had dyed my hair, what chance would God have if I don't mention it? I thought we were talking about the reader, Jason addressed all three with a rapid turning of his head. Reader, God, Carl began before pointing across to Tabitha. Goddess, she lifted her glass of water in recognition of his inclusion of the feminine term for divinity. It's all the same, what we're talking about here. And even if the spastic demon of 6th Street here, he gestured to Danny without looking at her, mixes her terms, we can cut her slack because, after all, this is a lady who feels it necessary to dye her hair a color that would anger a bull. I like my red hair, Danny said with a slight pout. Oh, honey, we all like your hair, Tabitha touched Danny's hand. It just might be that the holy Nimrod the Terrible line hit close to home for Carl. She directed her eyes towards the comedian. Right? Yeah, sure. No, really, yes. Carl was surprisingly articulate when he stammered through an honest emotion. I felt that was kind of harsh and just went for the obvious vulnerability. It's my reflex from stage. He touched her other hand. I'm sorry for that. Your hair looks nice, and I respect that you have the courage to do it. I would do it myself if I wasn't such a coward. You? Cowardly? Tabitha removed her hand from Danny, and Carl did the same as he spoke to the musician across the table from him. Of course. What do you think all the comedy is? It's the natural reaction we have to the unknown, that which scares us. The first step toward conquering it is to laugh at it. I internalize my laughter and put it into the jokes and points of view I perform. But I do it well because the fears I have which drive my sense of humor are always present. That's why you, he turned to address his young friend with the fiery locks, who had since regained her smile and comfort level, receive more of my needling. You are fearless, and there is very little that scares me more than a fearless woman. Fear is nothing to the heart other than what we allow it to be, Jason said, with startling clarity of voice. The others looked at him. If you want to be scared of something, be scared of your own self, yourself as it would be watched and known by a reader reading your entire life. Why would you be scared of yourself? Tabitha cut to the heart of the matter troubling Jason. Because the reader would know everything about you, everything that you would block out from your own memory, every thought that you struggle to keep in check, you would need to be perfectly aware of to have that understanding of yourself. The you that is interesting to the reader specifically because it is not tame or docile or good, because it is a mess of urges and drives and bad thoughts. That is what to be afraid of. Jason was more agitated by this than the others could recollect ever having seen him before. What if the reader wasn't there? Carl was truly interested in Jason's view on it. What if your thoughts and drives to action were yours to deal with alone? Would you still keep them in check? Of course. Jason seemed offended by the question. I do not need something watching over me for me to be compelled to do good. Then just let go of the idea that you are being read at all. Carl used a very disarming logic that was very effective on Jason's agitation. And if you can get past the fear of that kind of solitude, you should be fine. Carl gave a half smirk as he took a drink of water. Jason smiled and began his normal fidgety movements. Okay, Danny was trying to resolve this conversation's idea. If there is a reader or not makes no difference to us, but only to the reader. What we should do then is live our lives in as honest a manner as we can, be true to ourselves, even if we are not fully understood by others. That seems somewhat tragic. Tabitha could play instigator as well, and was returning the favors Danny had introduced earlier in the night. If the full capacity of the metaphors and meaning we live out have no meaning to anyone other than ourselves. Oh, they would have meaning, but not necessarily the meaning intended. The quick reply conjured a smile on Tabitha's closed lips before Danny continued. And the metaphor is never going to match up perfectly anyway. Hindsight is 20/20, right? Ladies wish they had such a good vision when it comes to my hind. Carl heard the joke as he was saying it and gave up halfway through on trying to make it something the others would find funny. He simply looked to his left, twisting at his waist in his chair to look for the waitress. Mercifully, upon his back did he glimpse her almost immediately, and in seeing his odd physical position, the waitress noticed him. As he noticed her attention, he made a gesture with his hand as though checking a box on an invisible paper in the air. Seeing this kinesthetic communication and understanding its meaning, the waitress nodded and ventured back to the closest register to print out the check for the four at the table. Danny was entranced by the ease of Carl's communication with the waitress regarding the check. And as she pondered the likelihood of such shallow forms of communicative endeavors being the social glue that holds together the world of humans interacting, Jason decided to weigh in. Hindsight is not 20/20 because as we progress through time and grow, the way we interpret our past actions changes, he said. Tabitha nodded and then watched as the waitress drew closer to the table, reaching for her purse on the floor as Jason continued. It could be argued that the way we remember our past actions changes also, which is why journaling and recording for the sake of history is so important. But what I'm trying to say is that even if we remember something clearly as it actually happened, we create new understanding of why it happened. We see greater reason as we have greater capacity in how we apply reason to our lives. He had reached for his wallet, extracting it from the front pocket of his pants as he glanced at the bill, which had already passed from Carl to Tabitha across the table after her silent hand gesture calling for it while Jason had been speaking. "So what's the damage?" Danny asked. "I wouldn't say it is damaging to change the reason we find for our past actions when we reflect upon them at various points in time, but I would say it is damaging to keep the same interpretation of them as time wears on." He had misinterpreted her question, and, oblivious of such, put a $20 bill from his wallet on the table. "How do the smart ones always have these quirks?" Carl asked while looking right at Jason and shaking his head slightly just prior to looking at Danny. "Put in 20 and I will cover you with my card. I got the tip." Jason was confused by Carl's question, and Tabitha caught his attention to tell him, "She was asking about the cost of the check, dear. Realizing his mistake, Jason's embarrassment quickly turned to slight humor aimed at his own self, and he smiled with a light exultation. While that brief clarification occurred, Danny addressed Carl's generosity. "That's nice, but why should you pay more?" "Because I'm in a better position right now. And because I don't want to waste time arguing with you skinflints over what would be acceptable socially, and given our current situation, I gotta get out of here," Carl responded while handing his credit card to the waitress. "Do you have a hot date?" Danny asked. "No, I'm performing over at Cap City in about an hour and with some new material. I don't want to feel rushed to get there." "Why? Do you want to come and be my hot date?" he teased. "Not tonight," she said. "What are you doing tomorrow?" "The lawn," he responded, and Jason giggled from across the table. "You really are impossible to get close to," Danny said while shaking her head, yet keeping her eyes locked on Carl. "With good cause," he said as though it was a matter of fact. "Between my relentless pursuit of the trivial and your preference in genitalia, we'd drive each other crazy in about 2 hours." "We've been sitting at this table for more than 3 hours," Danny insisted. "But you've had us as a buffer," Jason interjected, signaling with his index finger to he and Tabitha. "And might I say rightfully so," Carl added with a nod to Jason. Looking back to Danny, he said, "And even with this social buffer provided by these two, I think you all might agree that I am going crazier as the time wears on." He stood. "So I doubt any of you will come to see my set tonight." Jason shrugged and looked away. Tabitha spoke up. "I would, honey. But do you really want me to see that side of you?" "Not until I'm more refined. Not until I have a half hour on one of the networks, or basic cable for that matter." Carl haphazardly checked his pockets for his wallet and keys. You may want to wait for your card to return," Jason pointed out. "Unless you are in such a rush that you trust the barista with your high-limit card with barely any signature security." Carl sighed as Tabitha leaned towards Jason. "I think that might have been a little socially inappropriate to mention." "Come off it," Danny told Tabitha. "I'm the most broke out of us, and that is fine by me. I'm also the youngest and the hottest." "Speak for yourself," Carl joked as he wrote in a generous tip and scribbled what would never pass as a signature in a penmanship class on the receipt the waitress brought to him. "That's what I just—" Danny realized she had taken the bait of his joke. "Never mind." She leaned back in her chair and shook her head to herself while lightly biting her lower lip. The man across the room, who had finished his floral dessert, was looking at Danny's posture and bottom lip as it protruded from behind her teeth and bounced back into its place on her face. Someone dropped a piece of silverware on the floor, and for a brief instant everyone except him looked in the direction of the clang. "All right, dear friends, I am off," Carl said after returning his card to his wallet and his wallet to his pants pocket. "You could say that again." Danny raised an eyebrow as she said it with half a smirk. All right, dear friends, I am off," Carl repeated with a smile. Tabitha stood and tossed her wrap over her shoulders. "Have a great set tonight." "Yeah, man. I hope you get 'em rolling on the floor," Jason added while standing. "But if you roll on the floor with them," Danny stood as well, "be sure to use protection." With a fake laugh, Carl's face became an essence of comedic expression, an exaggerated form of sarcastic delight in what Danny had said. To drive home his point, he finished his little performance by saying, "Chortle, chortle, chortle," then kissed his own palm and swung it in a wave to the others around the table. Then he turned and walked hurriedly to the stairs that led to the restaurant's exit. Tabitha, Jason, and Danny were not so quick to walk, but began meandering in the same direction. "He is such a character sometimes," Danny said in reference to Carl. "Maybe to the reader, he is always such a character," Tabitha hearkened back to their conversation. "Aren't we all?" Jason asked. And the question became rhetorical, as no one could formulate an answer worth the effort to speak. But they each brooded mentally about the concept silently. It was Danny who, once they were outside, penetrated the silence with something they were all thinking. "Wouldn't that just be it? I mean, it. That would be the big it for existence, if everything we are and know, everything that was, is, and will ever be, is just background to the story each of us lives that is read by the reader for some reason or another. Wouldn't that just be the kick in the head?" "Oh, my dear," Tabitha cooed with musical affluence. "There is so much more than trying to simplify the grandeur of existence into some basic premise." She noticed that Danny and she were walking on either side of Jason, and she hooked her right arm around his. Danny's attention being on Tabitha, she mimicked the movement, and they both were walking arm in arm with Jason. Jason was always a little socially awkward. The misunderstandings he encountered from others were a source of his further alienation, as it served only to reinforce his nervous self-consciousness. Some time in the past, Tabitha noticed this negative feedback loop he would get trapped in, and, seeing as he was otherwise innocuous and actually very positive, started walking arm in arm with him during social outings that required walking. After seeing this nervous young man wearing an uncertain expression while strolling with Tabitha gently linking arms with him, Danny decided to join the fun, although if it were for the sheer joy of helping him become more comfortable with them, and also in general, or for some kind of psychologically sadistic endeavor, was never quite clear to her. The result, however, was that she and Tabitha wrought a change upon Jason that allowed him to loosen his guard a little with them. He could speak a little slower and not trip over his words so readily. The human contact brought him a sense of tension at first, and gradually a sense of relief. The times he felt most comfortable with himself were when he knew what he looked like with Tabitha on one arm and Danny on the other. It had become a common practice with them, and he thoroughly enjoyed that they gave the action so little attention that they would not introduce an awkward silence, but continue speaking as though this behavior was entirely normal and acceptable. That is what truly made the difference to him. The out-of-the-ordinary picture they were together while walking in this way made normal and acceptable by their own preference, and that resonated deeply with his own self-awareness regarding his socially awkward tendencies. He would not talk as much as they walked like this, but his breathing was easier, and he felt calm. When flanked by these two women he knew he would never be with sexually, but who he loved dearly. "I think it is anything but simple," Danny replied to Tabitha. "If the reader is all that our existence is for, then what is the essence of the reader? What would the reader's realm be like, and why would the reader be reading about us? But just the idea of the reader is too simple to be the grand reason," Tabitha told her to clarify. For all of the astounding versatility in humanity, all of the varied experiences and mighty strong emotions, all the trivial beauties, the silent sunrises, the unseen winds, the perpetual churning of the oceans, Jason whispered with just enough volume to be heard. Yes, Tabitha squeezed his arm. For all the subtle power of the world, to think that it only exists to be filtered through us to the reader is ridiculous. That's my point, Danny retorted. It is ridiculous. But wouldn't it make sense that such a ridiculous notion would be it? I mean, wouldn't that just be fitting? They walked quietly for a few more paces. Danny, Tabitha, Jason addressed them both. Whether or not there is an overseer, if the reader is real or not, I want you two to know how much this simple gesture of walking with me like this really means to me. He swore he could hear their smiles curl along their lips. And I want to thank you for that kindness of friendship, that basic humanness. And if you too mean it for other reasons than it evokes in me, I understand. But it is so true for me that I don't have any apprehension telling you. I love you. Oh my God, Danny happily erupted. Jason, that was just some of the most beautiful expression of gratitude I have ever had the privilege to receive, Tabitha told him. Well, ladies, you normalize me, he responded as they reached the corner. He removed his arm in such a manner that he gracefully slipped from the arms of his loves and immediately reverted to a more jittery rendition of his expression of self. But we got our cars in 3 separate directions and should part ways. Tabitha looked at him with a warm smile, holding his attention for a moment and then giving him a kiss on his cheek. Such a brilliant way with words. You call me if you need help through any task. Danny grabbed him by the back of his neck. And you call me if anyone ever gives you flack. I will grind them to ashes. Although such physical interaction would usually be very off-putting to him, Jason smiled as he rocked from Danny's grip. May the reader be amused and inspired by our lives. And Carl's too, Danny added. Good night, my dears, Tabitha concluded, and they each walked separately to their parked cars. As she walked, Tabitha was struck with a pang of recognition for the gravity of their conversation and became acutely aware that there very well may be a reader looking into her life and hearing more than the music which she claimed as her central component. She pondered if a reader could hear her music before she conjured it into reality, and if there was some transmutation of music into easily written language of the higher beings that would entrance them as much as it entranced her. What could possibly be her point to being if not for creating music? What if the music she created, the universal praises she sang, were nothing more than a means of entertaining herself, her soul, to keep her moving onward to activities that would entertain the reader? The reader was, in fact, not a listener, or at least not a listener in the way she would desire her music to be heard. How to use words to communicate all the instantaneous subtlety of her musical performances. The idea that the greatest form of bearing her soul could not be detected properly by the higher, the reader, the divine, scared her more than anything else she had ever known. All of her certainty, her disguise of wisdom, melted into a sudden insecurity, and she found herself moving quicker to get into her car, to turn on the radio, to seek the distraction of music in order to stop thinking of music as merely a means of distracting herself. She understood how small and insignificant herself felt with the onset of that cynical realization, and found herself asking the reader to know her music as she knew it to be. Walking along a line increasing in size, perpendicular to the one Tabitha trod on nervously, Jason thought of a similar set of notions, yet ones that were less concerned with the loneliness of the reader not possibly having the capacity to know his artistry, the kind that used the most base, superficial forms of expression to communicate with others, the most well-honed artifice of human communicative abilities, that of blending words and their meanings into plays of exotic currents, emotionally charged and wholly left to the interpretation of those who could experience them. The winding thoughts masking thinly the underlying sordid nature which he obscure, lest he be forced to face it himself. The notion that the reader could see into him to the points that he worked so hard to keep from the view of others struck him cold in the heart. To be so vulnerable, to have his innermost thoughts given way to the light of the reader's visage, greatly exacerbated an anxiety that he had thought conquered long ago. As he neared his car, he reached for his keys and fumbled as he pulled them from his pocket, dropping them onto the ground in a less than gracious manner. Not one to show her disconcerted feelings, yet feeling them with the full volume of raging, world-rocking, self-questioning uncertainty, Danny walked to her car. She opened the door and sat in the driver's seat and put the keys in the ignition. She thoughtfully placed her hands at the top of the wheel. With the semblance of solitude provided by the automobile, she rested her forehead to her hands and wept in ways she wished she could without the comfort of feeling like she was alone. And in a way she got her wish because, due to the conversation over dinner, she knew that she would never again be certain that she was alone.